Hello, and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in the witches, all the witches of England, including the Grand High Witch herself, were turned into mice. And although we don't necessarily see it, it is implied that the waiters of the hotel and the hotel's restaurant killed them. So now there are no more witches in England. But where is this story going to finish off? Well, we're about to find out in the last 2 chapters. You ready? Alright. Let's begin. Chapter 21. The Heart of a Mouse. It was lovely to be back in Norway once again in my grandmother's fine old house. But now that I was so small, everything looked different, and it took me quite a while to find my way around. Mine was a world of carpets and table legs and chair legs and little crannies behind large pieces of furniture. A closed door could not be opened, and nothing could be reached that was on a table. But after a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make my life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall stepladders, and she placed one of these against each table in the house so that I could climb up whenever I wanted to. She herself invented a wonderful door-opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys, with heavy weights dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door opener on it. All I had to do was to press my front paws onto a tiny wooden platform, and hey, presto, a spring would stretch and a weight would drop and the door would swing open. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system whereby I could switch on the light whenever I entered a room at night. I cannot explain how it worked, because I know nothing about electricity. There was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room in the house, and when I pressed the button gently with one paw, the second light would come on. The light would come on. When I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush, using a matchstick for the handle, and into this she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off one of her hairbrushes. "You must not get any holes in your teeth," she said. "I can't take a mouse to a dentist. He'd think I was crazy." "It's funny," I said, "but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolates, so I don't think I'll get any holes." "You're still going to brush your teeth after every meal," my grandmother said. And I did. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, and I bathed in it every night before going to bed. She allowed no one else into the house, not even a servant or a cook. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, "I wonder what happened to that little Bruno. I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket," I answered. "I'm afraid you may be right," my grandmother said. "Poor little thing." We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar while I dozed comfortably in the warmth. "Can I ask you something, Grandmama?" I said. "Ask me anything you like, my darling." "How long does a mouse live?" "Ah," she said, I've been waiting for you to ask me that." There was a silence. She sat there smoking away and gazing at the fire. "Well," I said, "how long do we live, us mice?" "I've been reading about mice," she said. "And I've been trying to find out everything I can about them." "Go on then, Grandmama. Why don't you tell me?" "If you really want to know," she said, "I'm afraid a mouse doesn't live for a very long time." "How long?" I asked. "Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years. But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person, and that is a very different matter." "How different?" I asked. "How long does a mouse person live, Grandmama?" "Longer," she said. "Much longer." "How much longer?" I asked. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse, my grandmother said. About 9 years. Good, I cried. That's great. It's the best news I've ever had. Why do you say that? She asked, surprised. Because I would never want to live longer than you, I said. I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else. There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. How old are you, Grandmama? I asked. I'm 86, she said. Will you live another 8 or 9 years? I might, she said, with a bit of luck. You've got to, I said, because by then I'll be a very old mouse and you will be a very old grandmother. And soon after that we'll both die together. That would be perfect, she said. I recommend watching the movie after reading the book. I had a little doze after that. I just shut my eyes and thought of nothing and felt at peace with the world. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that is very interesting? My grandmother said. Yes, please, Grandmama, I said without opening my eyes. I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true, she said. What is it? I asked. The heart of a mouse, she said, and that means your heart is beating at the rate of over 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing? It's not possible, I said, opening my eyes wide. It's as true as I'm sitting here, she said. It's a sort of miracle. That's nearly 9 beats every second, I cried, working out in my head. Correct, she said. Your heart is going so fast it's impossible to hear the separate beats. All one hears is a soft humming sound. She was wearing a lace dress, and the lace kept tickling my nose. I had to rest my head on my front paws. Have you ever heard my heart humming away, Grandmama? I asked her. Often, she said. I hear it when you are lying very close to me on my pillow at night. The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. My darling, she said at last, are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life? I don't mind at all, it said. I said, it doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, so long as somebody loves you. Well, he raises a good point there. Now we come to the final chapter. Chapter 22. It's off to work we go. Please don't start singing hi-ho, people. This is not that story. For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelette and 1 slice of bread. I had a piece of that brown Norwegian's goat's milk cheese, known as geitost, which I had loved even when I was a boy. We ate in front of the fire, my grandmother in her armchair and me on the table with my cheese on a small plate. Grandmama, I said, now that we have done away with the Grand High Witch, will all the other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm quite sure they won't, she answered. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. I'm afraid not, she said. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all the money they need? And who is going to give them orders and jazz them up at the annual meetings and invent all their magic formulas for them? When a queen bee dies, there's always another queen in the hive ready to take her place, my grandmother said. It's the same with witches. In the great headquarters where the Grand High Witch lives, there's always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over should anything happen. Oh no, I cried. That means everything we did was for nothing. Have I become a mouse for nothing at all? We saved the children of England, she said. I don't call that nothing. I know, I cried, but that's not nearly good enough. I felt sure that all the witches of the world would slowly fade away after we had got rid of their leader. Now you tell me that everything is going to go on just the same as before? Not exactly as before, my grandmother said. For instance, there are no longer any witches in England. That's quite a triumph, isn't it? But what about the rest of the world, I cried. What about America, and France, and Holland, and Germany? And what about Norway? You must not think I have been sitting back and doing nothing these last few days, she said. I have been giving a great deal of thought and time to that particular problem. I was looking up at her face when she said this, and all at once I noticed that the little secret smile was beginning to spread slowly around her eyes and the corners of her mouth. Why are you smiling, Grandmama? I asked her. I have some rather interesting news for you, she said. What news? Shall I tell it to you right from the beginning? Yes, please, I said. I like good news. She had finished her omelette, and I had had enough of my cheese. She wiped her lips with a napkin and said, As soon as we arrived back in Norway, I picked up the telephone and made a call to England. Who in England, Grandmama? To the chief of police in Bournemouth, my darling. I told him I was the chief of police for the whole of Norway, and that I was interested in the peculiar happenings that had taken place recently in the Hotel Magnificent. Oh, hang on a second, Grandmama, I said. There's no way an English policeman is going to believe that you are the head of the Norwegian police. I am very good at imitating a man's voice, she said. Of course he believed me. The policeman in Bournemouth was honoured to get a call from the chief of police for the whole of Norway. So what did you ask him? I asked him for the name and address of the lady who had been living in room 454 in the Hotel Magnificent, the one who disappeared. You mean the Grand High Witch? I cried. Yes, my darling. And did he give it to you? Naturally, he gave it to me. One policeman will always help another policeman. Why, jolly, you've got a nerve, Grandmama. By golly, what? You've got a nerve, Grandmama. I wanted her address, my grandmother said. But how did he know her address? But did he know her address? He did indeed. They had found her passport in the room, and her address was in it. It was also in the hotel register. Everyone who stays in a hotel has to put a name and address in the book. But surely the Grand High Witch wouldn't have put her real name and address in the hotel register, I said. Why ever not, my grandmother said. Nobody in the world had the faintest idea who she was except the other witches. Wherever she went, people simply knew her as a nice lady. You, my darling, and you alone were the only non-witch ever to see her with her mask off. Even in her home district, in the village where she lived, people knew her as a kindly and very wealthy baroness who gave large sums of money to charity. I have checked up on that. I was getting excited now. And that address you've got, Grandmama, that must have been the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. It still is, my grandmother said, and that will be where the new Grand High Witch is certain to be living at this very moment, with a retinue of special assistant witches. Important rules are always surrounded by a large retinue of witch assistants. Where's her headquarters, Grandmama? I cried. Tell me quick where it is. It is a castle, my grandmother said. And the fascinating thing is that in that castle will be all the names and addresses of all the witches in the world. How else could a Grand High Witch run her business? How else could she summon the witches of the various countries to their annual meetings? Where's the castle, Grandmama? I cried impatiently. Which country? Tell me quick. Guess, she said. Norway, I cried. Right first time, she answered. High up in the mountains above the small village. This was thrilling news. I did a little dance of excitement on the tabletop. My grandmother was getting pretty worked up herself, and now she heaved herself out of her chair and began pacing up and down the room, thumping the carpet with her stick. So we have work to do, you and I, she cried out. We have a great task ahead of us. Thank heavens you are a mouse. A mouse can go anywhere. All I have to do is put you somewhere near the Grand High Witch's castle, and you will very easily be able to get inside and creep around, looking and listening to your heart's content. I will, I answered. No one will ever see me. Moving about in a big castle will be a child's play compared with going into a crowded kitchen full of cooks and waiters. You could spend days in there if necessary, my grandmother cried. In her excitement, she was waving her stick all over the place, and suddenly she knocked over a tall and very beautiful vase that went crashing onto the floor and smashed into a million pieces. Forget it, she said. It's only Ming. You could spend weeks in that castle if you wanted to, and they'd never know you were there. I myself would get a room in the village, and you could sneak out to the castle and have supper with me every night and tell me what was going on. I cried out, and inside the castle I could go snooping around simply everywhere. But your main job, of course, my grandmother said, would be to destroy every witch in the place. That really would be the end of the whole organization. Me destroy them, I cried. How could I do that? Can't you guess, she said. Tell me, I said. Mousemaker, my grandmother shouted. Formula 86 delayed action mousemaker all over again. You will feed it to everyone in the castle by putting drops of it into their food. You do remember the recipe, don't you? Every bit of it, I answered. You mean we're going to make it ourselves? Why not, she cried. If they can make it, so can we. It's just a question of knowing what goes into it. Who's going to climb up the tall trees to get the gruntle's eggs, I asked her. I will, she cried. I'll do it myself. There's plenty of life in this old dog yet. I think I'd better do that part of it, Grandmama. You might become a cropper. Those are just details, she cried, waving her stick again. We shall let nothing stand in our way. And what happens after that, I asked her, after the new Grand High Witch and everyone else in the castle have been turned into mice? Then the castle will be completely empty and I shall come in and join you in. Wait, I cried. Hold on, Grandmama, I've just had a nasty thought. What nasty thought, she said. When the mousemaker turned me into a mouse, I said, I didn't become just any old ordinary mouse that you catch with mousetraps. I became a talking, thinking, intelligent mouse person who couldn't go near a mousetrap. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks. She already knew what was coming next. Yeah, so do I. Therefore, I went on, if we use the mousemaker to turn the new Grand High Witch and all the other witches into the castle into mice, the whole place will be swarming with very clever, very nasty, very dangerous, talking, thinking mouse witches. There will be witches in mouses' clothing, and that, I added, would be very horrible indeed. Golly, you're right, she cried. That never occurred to me. I couldn't possibly take on a castle full of mouse witches, I said. Nor could I, she said. They'd have to be got rid of at once. They'd have to be smashed and bashed and chopped up into little pieces exactly as they were in the Hotel Magnificent. I'm not doing that, I said. I couldn't anyway. I don't think you could either, Grandmama, and mousetraps wouldn't be the slightest use. By the way, I added, the Grand High Witch. Who did me in was wrong about mousetraps? Wasn't she? Yes, my grandmother said impatiently, but I'm not concerned with that Grand High Witch. She's been chopped up long ago by the hotel chef. It's the new Grand High Witch we've got to deal with now. The one up in the castle and all her assistants. As a Grand High Witch is bad enough when she's disguised as a lady, but just think of what she could do if she were a mouse. She could go anywhere. I've got it, I shouted. Leaping out about a foot in the air. I've got the answer. Tell me, my grandmother snapped. The answer's cats, I shouted. Bring on the cats! My grandmother stared at me. Then a great grin spread over her face and she shouted, It's brilliant! Absolutely brilliant! Shove half a dozen cats into that castle, I cried, and they'll kill every mouse in the place in 5 minutes. I don't care how clever they are. You're a magician, my grandmother shouted, starting to wave her stick about once again. Look out for the vases, Grandmama. To heck with the vases, she shouted. I'm so third I don't care if I break the lot. Just one thing, I said. You've got to make absolutely sure I'm well out of the way myself before you put the cats in. That's a promise, she said. What do we do after the cats have killed all the mice, I asked her. I'll take all the cats back to the village and then you and I will have the castle completely to ourselves. And then, I said, then we shall go through the records and get the names and addresses of all the witches in the whole wide world. And after that, I said, quivering with excitement, after that, my darling, the greatest task of all will begin for you and me. We shall pack our bags and go travelling all over the world. In every country we visit, we shall seek out the houses where the witches are living. We shall find each mouse one by one, and having found it, you will creep inside and leave your little drops of deadly mouse maker in the bread or the cornflakes or the rice pudding or whatever food you see lying about. It will be a triumph, my darling, a colossal, unbeatable triumph. We shall do it entirely by ourselves, just you and me. That will be our work for the rest of our lives. My grandmother picked me up off the table and kissed me on the nose. Oh, my goodness me, we're going to be busy these next few weeks and months and years, she cried. I think we are, I said, but what fun and excitement it's going to be. You can say that again, my grandmother cried, giving me another kiss. I can't wait to get started. The end. I hope you all enjoyed it, and be sure to check out the 1990 movie version of The Witches with Angelica Houston as the Grand High Witch herself. And this was before she was Morticia Addams in the Addams Family. So, plus the film was produced by Jim Henson. Another winner. Well, I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time on Story Time with Eric Zimmer. Take care.